Formosum pastor corridon ardebat Alexi, delicias domini ne quid speraret habebat, tanto interdensas umbrosa cacumina fagos, assidue venniebat ibhaec incondita solus, montibus et silvis studio iactabat in song. O crudelis Alexi nihil mea carmina curas, nil nostri miserere mori medenique coges.
The classical pastoral is deeply rooted in the literary conventions, archetypes, and motifs which accompany it. The shepherd, the countryside, the beautiful woman. Claire Pace suggests the following motifs as key in the composition of the pastoral. A tree or group of trees, a sacred grove, to provide shade from the midday sun. Water, generally a pool or stream, to offer refreshment. Soft A commonly held perception is that the classical mode was built upon ideals. It is, after all, where we get the terms bucolic, Arcadian, and idyll, and centres around retirement discourse. This is largely due to the fact that Theocritus and Virgil did not present their shepherds at labour. Toil would indeed cloud the otium and contemplativa, so central to the thematic identities of the works. Epicurean philosophy is visible in the celebratory depictions of nature's abundance, the locus amoenus, typical of the genre. Yet there is more depth to it than pure setting. Theocritus uses the stylized motifs of singing and dialogue, as well as the archetypes of shepherd and distant lover, but introduces more unhappy instances of lovesickness and even the death of Daphnis. These are absorbed into the pastoral setting, and the natural world reflects the grief of the shepherds. This mingling of the real, human condition and its weaknesses, alongside the dramatic fabrications of pathetic fallacy and idealism, have been described by Siegel as a tension between realism and artificiality in Theocritus. Claire also likens this pastoral topos to the more general classical concern with fate, lifestyle, and metamorphoses in general. During the 14th century, Petrarch, Dante, and Boccaccio revived the genre as part of their humanist objective to raise the classics and improve contemporary literature through imitation of ancient technique. Transferring the iconic images and stylistic conventions, they raised the pastoral once again to public taste. At first, the style was put into Latin, but then, as it became vogue, vernacular creations and imitations were begun. This first wave imitation was then taken as the basis for a second imitation by the British humanists. The iconic nature of the pastoral, however, is systematically maintained in almost every pre-Romantic author's use of the genre. The great divide between the neoclassical and rationalistic schools, as J.E. Congleton suggests, was not widespread until the later parts of the 17th century and beyond. However, this does indeed suggest that even pre-Romantic authors were grappling with the demands of divergent modes of thought. At once they were subjected to both the reactionist elevation of classical modes and the new, modern insurgence of realism. The icons of the genre remained, it seems, but the philosophical gravity underneath became tuned to the contemporary feelings of its authors. I say tuned because the feelings, though separated by 1800 years, still hinge on similar tensions. The conflicts between idealism and realism, escapism and activism, and the rural and the urban. The Restoration wits began thinking critically of this divide between town and country, propagated by the Pastoral. William Wycherley wrote his sarcastic The Country Wife in the stylized genre of comedy of manners about the corruptness of the town and the stupidity of its cast of crooks and tarts. This is an interesting example of how a similar mode of consciousness may be presented using completely different generic conventions. Even during the first wave, there were many layers of irony, pastiche, and detachment. Guy P. Raffer writes of Dante that he used the scenery, imagery, and style of the Pastoral for completely different purposes than the criticism of the town, so iconic of the Pastoral. This fluidity of generic meaning confused many of the critics of Pastoral. Rapine writes, "But 'tis hard to give rules for that, for which there have been none already given. For where there are no footsteps nor path to direct, I cannot tell how anyone can be certain of his way." In this way, it seems hard to think of the Romantics as rebelling against a strict and ordered idealism, as they seem to suggest. The former is consistent only by its iconic outward showings of convention, and not by its inward philosophy. The neoclassical work by Phillips follows such conventions. He uses the form of a dialogue, Colinet and Thenot, the persona of the shepherd, repeated exclamations, "Ah me the while," emotional lamentation, "the unhappy hour," aesthetic beauty, "fair Sabrina," the image of sheep, "my pining flock," detachment, "from thy loved house what tempted thee to stray," and the tree, "on a bending willow rest my head." Yearsley's later verse, however, is more textually and acutely aware of her art and the generic binds under which it is expressed. She uses a similar amount of exclamation and thematic convention, love and liberty, but a far greater amount of abstract nouns and verbs in comparison to the more concrete depictions of sheep and trees in Phillips. Perhaps this is indicative of the greater self-consciousness writers possessed. See the implications of the Pastoral as genre in the later, part of the century. Yet the same tonal style is employed. This is evidence of the complexity of genre. Suspicions and attentions, however, were paid before the more famous break of pre- and post-Romanticism. The generic movement was in fact the public exposition of these pre-existing tensions, contained under the umbrella of genre. The outward stylistics of Pastoral, then, seem to betray something much more fluid, that being the nature of poetic art, underneath its iconography. Paul Apers summarises, "We are told that Pastoral is a double longing after innocence and happiness, that it is based on the philosophical antithesis of art and nature, that its universal idea is the golden age, that its fundamental motive is hostility to urban life, that its central tenet is the pathetic fallacy, that it expresses the ideal of otium, that it is founded on Epicureanism, that in the Renaissance it is the poetic expression par excellence of the cult of aesthetic Platonism." It is easy to become frustrated with this wide net of qualities and literary conventions attributed to the Pastoral, but it seems that this width of definition is somewhat characteristic of the mode itself. As a mode about seeking happiness and innocence, by its very nature transcends artistic stylistic criteria and ventures into the philosophical. But perhaps then, the actual Pastoral is a narrow mode, something which we understand to be the superficial and aesthetic images of shepherds and sheep and countryside, and actually it seems underneath are in fact the themes of art and nature itself.